Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of Alta Asks Live. This is the digital video version of Alta Asks, an author interview series we do at altaonline.com. Today, I am so excited to welcome Steph Cha. Steph is the author of Your House Will Pay, and I can actually see in the comments over here that we have most of you have probably already read this incredible book. It has won numerous awards. And when I say numerous, I don't have enough fingers and toes to count them. It's also critically acclaimed by just about everyone, including Alta contributor Oscar Villalon. He joins us as today's interviewer. He reviewed Your House Will Pay for Alta. He's the editor of Ziziva magazine, another magazine you should support. And he's a member of the selection committee of Alta's new California book club. I'm going to link to that over here just in case you're interested in joining a very exciting new book club for free. Steph, our guest today, has a short story. So I noticed someone was asking if Steph had any short stories that are published. Yes, she does. In the newest issue of Alta, we're all noir themed with the current issue, and Steph's short story, The Plagues, is included in there. If you'd like to read it, you can click on the green button directly below me and it'll take you there to read that. If you'd like to subscribe to Alta as a member, you can visit altaonline.com and join us. We would love, love, love to have you. Most importantly, we're delighted to have you join us today. So with that, I'm going to be monitoring your questions and your comments. And I'll return at the end to try and see if we have time to tackle as many of those as we can. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Oscar and Steph.
Okay. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
Steph, hello.
Hi.
And before we begin, congratulations on the book. Congratulations on the paperback. That came out recently. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it came out like a month and a half ago, 2 months ago.
Oh, beautiful. I think before we begin our conversation, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind reading a little bit from Your House Will Pay. And then after you're done reading, then we can begin.
Yeah. I'm going to read a short passage from, this is my UK paperback, by the way. It's the last already. I'm going to read a short passage from the beginning of the third section. And this is after the Rodney King verdict has come in, and the main character, Shawn, has gone out with some friends and set fire to a Korean-owned liquor store. It lasted 6 days. 6 days of fire, a judgment poured over the earth. Figaro Liquor Mart was gone, and Frank's Liquor, Florence Liquor and Grocery, Empire Market, and Jingle Bell Liquor too. Laundromats were destroyed, the machines jacked for coins, dry cleaners looted, plenty of people grabbing the chance to take somebody else's clothes. Some places put up signs like lamb's blood on their doors. Black owned, they said, and they were passed over. Sometimes. Terry's Interiors got the torch and Rod Davis Firestone and the African Refugee Center. After a while, fire didn't discriminate. They called in the National Guard. 63 people were dead. Shawn watched it all happen. When the law didn't come, the lawless spread out. There were bangers everywhere, bold because the police were gone and because they had a truce for once. Their priorities shifted away from each other. When they started getting crews together to ride up into Koreatown, Shawn went with them, riding in the back seat of Sparky's grandma's Ford Escort, not even bothering to lie to Aunt Sheila. Koreatown, it was where the Koreans were, Chung Ja-han's people. The people who believed and supported her, who thought Ava was Han's bad fortune, a thing that had happened to her, like a car crash or a storm. It made sense to him to take this outcry to Koreatown. They would bring this judgment to them, to her community, her family, to her. When it was over, everything had changed. Wherever he went, he saw the extent of the ruin, the cooled remnants of days of unchecked wrath. Where there had been buildings, there were now building frames like children's pictures scribbled in pencil, gray and blurred and skeletal on the verge of disintegration. Roll-up doors defaced by graffiti and ash, the metal warped so they'd never close again. Rubble and trash littered the streets like fallen teeth, like dead skin, the rot of a ravaged body. The neighborhood looked like a war zone, a place like nowhere he'd ever seen outside of photographs, but he lived in it now. Victim, civilian, soldier, insurgent. He was different, still changing, the core of him destabilized and reformed by the fire. He joined up with the Bering Cross Crips, Sparky vouching for him, saying he'd been through it, that he was stone cold for 14. Ray and Sparky and 4 other guys jumped him in at the parking lot of True Way Baptist the week after the uprising. The church's pink stucco walls charred black all the way up to the steeple. They formed a circle around him, each of them locking eyes on him and nodding, starting the ritual. Ray came at him first, and they swung at each other like they had a dozen times before, landing a punch each before the other boys moved in turn. He kept his fists up and gave them his best, and they knocked him down, each of them laying hands on him until he was on the ground. As he lay there taking hits, his muscles singing, the taste of blood in his throat, he gave himself over to the boys and the pain. How great it was, the controlled aggression of family, to know the hurt would never be more than he could stand.
Thank you, Steph. It's been said that if you want to understand a place in its society, you should look at its crime.
Yeah.
And I want to ask you further if you agreed with that. And if so, how then does a crime story, say, or a tale of noir illuminate how we're living?
This is probably the main reason that I'm interested in crime fiction. I think to understand people, to understand a place, to understand society, it's really instructive to look at the people who are hurting each other, and and who's causing the harm, and who becomes the victim of the harm. And I think when you zoom out and look at a society at large, you can tell like where the kind of fracture points are in that society by who the criminals are and who the victims are, and the way that these issues get kind of worked out in the justice system. And there are so many flaws in any given system. I don't think any society has worked out a perfect system, but like those flaws, wherever they are, they become really apparent when things go wrong, and you see which directions they go wrong. That tells you like almost everything you need to know about a place, I would say.
I think one of the things I found so fascinating about Your House Will Pay is that it's an examination of those flaws. In this case, showing the events or should we say the circumstances behind the uprising around Rodney King after the verdicts came out, but also an examination really at a system that keeps repeating itself. I mean, during the protests following George Floyd, continuing really, and Breonna Taylor, I couldn't help but thinking about your novel. And one of the things I was thinking about your novel was how you do two things. One, you kind of shake the reader by his or her shoulders and say, how can you be surprised by any of this? But also, two, that these are also people whose lives are going to continue long after the protests, long after, unfortunately, the next police shooting happens, the next or unprosecuted killing happens. And we're sort of this. I think that sort of context is really critical.
Yeah, I have you read Citizen, Claudia Rankine's?
Yes.
Yeah, and everyone should read that book if you haven't already. I mean, you probably have. It's an amazing book of criticism and poetry. And one thing that is salient about that book is it has either at the beginning or the end, it has a list of names of Black people who have been killed by police. And that book was such a huge bestseller, and I think Grey Wolf published it, like a smaller publisher. So, they reprinted it several times. And every time that book gets reprinted, that list of names is longer and longer. And I mean, and if you can think, it's just such an effortless distillation of the problem that she's talking about, right? I worked on Your House Will Pay. I started it at the end of 2014, and I finished the last edits in like May of last year. And and when I started it, it probably would have counted as timely in the way that it feels timely now, because end of 2014 was after Michael Brown was killed, and there was rioting in Ferguson, and there was Freddie Gray and Baltimore, and the kind of temperature of the country was similar to what it is today. But because I was writing this book, and because I was writing it, and obviously, like, I wrote this book because these are issues that I care about deeply. But so I was paying attention to what was going on in those intervening years when violence against Black bodies was not necessarily like the top headline every news cycle. It never went away. It's never something like Black people don't get a break from being killed. Even if the news cycle does. And so that was something that's really stood out to me. And as I was writing this book, I kept thinking about different people, so because there was always some story, and I was always thinking about some family that was like impacted in this particularly cruel way. It was just right there in front of me that this happened to the Brown family. And by the end of my writing of the book, I was thinking about Stephon Clark because that story was in the news. Stephon Clark had just been murdered in his own, in his like mother's house, right? And I think when George Floyd was murdered, I had a number of people reaching out and telling me that they thought about my book and they were glad that they read it, and I was very, very glad that I was able to give them some context for this if they didn't already, or like that I gave them, that I put like a fictional angle on it. But I guess like I never thought of this book as a novel that was tied to one particular time, because it starts in the 1990s and it ends in 2019, and I feel like all of the issues that would have been there in 1991 were present when the book was published, and they continue to be present and relevant now.
Yet, and so a couple of things there that I want to unpack, because I think it's so interesting. There is, yes, that sort of timeliness to it, but your book is so beautifully rooted in place, and even within the time from the 90s to contemporary times as well. And I bring that up because I wanted to ask you a question too. I wanted to ask you this: that even though one has the intention of wanting to write a book or a crime novel that illuminates our society, I mean, it's just not enough to want to do that. And in taking your work in as an example, how important then is it to get the external and the internal, say the psychology, the details right, so that the truth can bubble up? Or that's to say, how much of this is research, and how much of it is an intuition about what makes people tick?
Definitely a combination, because I think if I had done it with all research, it would have been one kind of book. If I'd done it with all intuition, it would have been another kind of book, and both versions would have been very bad. I think that, and especially because I wrote a book where, half of it takes place from the point of view of a Korean-American woman and a Korean-American family, and half of it takes place from the point of view of a Black man and a Black family. And I think that if I had been like, oh yeah, no, I'll just wing it, I think it would have come out like pretty unbalanced, just because of who I am. Honestly, I think the book that would have been written, because there was a point where I considered just writing it all from the point of view of Grace or somebody like Grace. But I realized, if I did that, then probably what would have happened was like, I don't think I would have written a book that was like filled with racist stereotypes. I think I would have written a book where like the Black family was like this group of angels, who aren't that interesting, who are like flattened, So I think, so I think research was a big part of it. I felt like I had to get the history, because I wanted this to be a book that felt like it was of a piece with the history of Los Angeles. So I felt like I needed to understand that history of Los Angeles very well. And I was also interested in, the places where these characters lived. I'm gonna let my dog out because he has no idea. So I was interested in getting Granada Hills and Northridge and Palmdale correct, because these are real places where real people live. And so I didn't want to, I wanted them to feel real. but then once I did the research, and I read a lot about Black migration to Los Angeles, and there actually is less reading material on this, but there has been this like large exodus of Black people from the central parts of LA into the exurbs, and I tried to read what I could on that because I think that is like a very interesting story that I haven't read that much about, and so I wanted to get the external stuff right, so that I could situate my characters in a place that felt real. And then once I got there, so an early draft, I most of my time, I spent probably over 2 years working on the first third of the book. The second and the latter 2/3 came much more easily once I figured out the characters and their voices. But one of the earlier drafts of the first third, my husband read it, and the feedback he gave me was that Grace felt like somebody I knew, and Shawn felt like somebody I'd read about. That's the result when you just do the research. And so once I did the research and kind of felt comfortable writing about these characters in this world, then it's just the kind of the novel writing craft part where you kind of dig in and get to know your characters, kind of respect them as if they're real people, and try to give them dimensionality. And so that was the rest of the work.
How much of writing this particular book, I know because you also written other books, also set in Los Angeles as well, but over the course of all your books, including Your House Will Pay, how much of writing about Los Angeles, how much of it has changed your understanding of where you live?
Oh, that's a great question. I think also because of the timing of it, I started writing Follow Our Home, which was my first novel. I started writing that book in 2008 when I was in my early 20s. And, I grew up in LA, but, I grew up very sheltered. I had very strict parents, so I kind of didn't leave the house very much except to like go to church and go to like SAT school. And I went to private high school, I went to private school. So I felt like my understanding of LA was pretty limited. And my sense of the geography, even of the city, was pretty limited. And then I went away for college and law school. So when I started writing it coincides with the time when I was really getting to know Los Angeles as an adult. And so it's hard to separate out how much of it I would have been learning on my own anyway. But I think LA is an extremely interesting city with a lot of different pockets. I still don't feel like I have this. I still don't think I have any kind of mastery of the city. But it's a place that I'm always learning from, and part of the way I learn about it is I write about it. I read about it, write about it. I'm just interested in this place and the people in it.
Well, incredibly, diverse, and by diverse I mean not in the sense of how we may think of diverse. Like for example, I'm Mexican American, but when I'm in LA, I know that in some places where being Mexican American, that's sort of a one size fits all label. In Los Angeles, there's all kinds of Mexicans. There's people from Oaxaca who are indigenous, and there's people from the north, who are more passed for white, etc. It's a whole array. There's Afro Mexicans. There's all kinds of stuff going on. And I think one of the things I admire so much about Your House Will Pay is how it does give the reader the sense of there's a bigger world out there, and it's not even. Usually when we use those terms, we think it's a big, wondrous world. Like, well, yes, it is, but no, just in the sense of what you think is quotidian isn't really quotidian. It's much more interesting than you could even imagine.
Yeah, I imagine, for example, that when people from outside of LA think about Korean Americans in the U.S., if they think about us at all, probably could not. It takes a few more levels of drilling down to get to like Korean American community in like Los Angeles, which is one city in LA, and then the difference between Koreans who grew up in the Valley and Koreans who grew up near Koreatown, and also wealthy Koreans and poor Koreans and new immigrants and their kids. I think there are just all these differences within even this small community. So much of one of the things I want to tackle in this book is that, the way that we, and by we, I mean like Americans, even Americans who are like paying close attention,
Mm-hmm.
there's a tendency to think about racial dynamics in the US as very black and white. And I find myself falling into this all the time. And I think sometimes it is like an appropriate framework, and it is like a useful way to think about how politics work, even when you're talking about other people of color. Because, depending on the circumstance, like Mexican American or Korean American can code as a person of color or white, right? So it's still it is still a useful way to look at race. But it is kind of broad, and there are all these other dynamics that are worth exploring, and I knew that the Black Korean like the animus between like the Black and Korean communities stemming from basically when Koreans started coming to LA en masse, that dynamic has existed. That was something I hadn't read about and something I wanted to look at, because it's something that like, I like, this book is one where there are very few white characters at all, but the backdrop for this book really is white supremacy. Even if the characters themselves are not white, they live lives that have been defined, whether they know it or not, by a structure that pits together Black people and immigrants, for example, and that's all about, the absence of white investment, white flight. It's about these groups being kind of lower on the totem pole in this country, where they're all trying to kind of create a space for themselves and their families, and having to kind of fight it out.
Indeed. So I think, Beth, we have, do I call you back at this point? Because I could go on with Steph, but I think we probably want to ask folks if they have questions. Like, oh.
Here I am. Hi. Yeah, we do want to get to some questions, if that's okay. Thanks, guys. I subscribe to the theory of leave them wanting more. Okay, so Steph, Jim Turner wants to know, how are you spending your time during these pandemic months?
Oh, well, I had a baby in April, so
congratulations. Mostly
that. So I think he's eating or will be eating soon right now. I don't know. Usually I have him. My husband has been working from home, which is great, because, when, I guess if he weren't, and it weren't pandemic times, I could hire somebody to watch my kid. But for now, we kind of like, I watch him most of the time because my husband's job is not flexible at all. And if I need to do something, my husband will heroically watch his own child. But yeah, it's been a lot of watching the kid. I was actually thinking the other day that he's going to be 6 months old this next week, and I was thinking if these were normal times, this is around the time when I'd feel like I wanted to really get back to work and like hire somebody to babysit for like 20 hours a week. But I'm just going to see how this goes for now. Luckily, I started a new job. I'm editing the Best American Mystery and Suspense Stories. That's an anthology that's an annual anthology, and the first one I'm editing will come out next year. So I have to read like a ton of short stories, and between now and January. So I've been doing that, and that's something that I can do with a kid pretty easily. Honestly, I feel like I've seen all these people competing for who has it worse, like people who don't have kids and people who do have kids, and I feel very lucky. I think that I have it best. I have a number of friends who also have had their first children during the pandemic, and I think it's a great time to have a first kid because, I don't know, he doesn't know what he's missing, and I feel like we'd be quarantined anyway, in a sense. I don't think we're missing out on that much, and he definitely keeps us from being bored and going. He's also very easy. He's a wonderful baby. So that's most of it.
Very cute. You can see him on Twitter. Steph tweeted a photo of him last night during the debate, and Roxay Gay commented on it.
I thought I thought about printing her. She called him very cute and juicy, and I thought maybe I'll get that printed on a onesie, and I'll have a baby who's been blurbed by Roxane Gay.
I mean, I was quite excited for you. Okay. I really love the complexity of your characters. They are human and multifaceted, not just good or bad. Do you have a favorite character?
In this book, yeah, I mean, I think Shawn is my favorite character. I think I really enjoyed writing Grace, and Grace has parts. You know, both Grace and Miriam have a lot of me in them. They're both Korean-American women and who grew up kind of in a churchy second generation Koreans in like a family who like went to church and was part of this Valley Korean community. And Grace carries a lot of naivete, which was kind of a hallmark of who I feel like I was for a lot of my life. Sometimes I wonder if I hadn't kind of, I don't know, widened my worldview at some point, I would probably just be a lot like her. And so because of that, I have a lot of affection for her. And I also am like frustrated with her in a way that probably means I like Shawn better. No, I think Shawn was also just such a labor of love for me. And yeah, I felt like by the end of the book, I just felt really deeply for him, and he's somebody who I think, I feel like I put a lot of work into him, and I feel like I understand him as a character, and that he's somebody who I have a lot of respect for. You know, I wanted to write about, I wanted to write all of my characters kind of as people who try to find some kind of dignity in a world that has denied them dignity. And he is a character with a lot of dignity.
All right. Keone Young says, I came to Los Angeles in the 1960s and experienced conflict between first-generation Koreans and Japanese Americans. What's your take on that?
Oh, you know, I think, I think as somebody who grew up here in like I don't know, I was born in the 80s. So I haven't seen a lot of that conflict. In fact, I feel like my interactions with other Asian Americans is like at the point where like where our families came from just matters a lot less than being Asian American. I think that's something that happens when you like come to the US. I do know that my family, you know, with my grandparents' generation, you know, they have a lot of resentment towards Japan and the Japanese government. And you know, I feel a lot of that too, because it's something I've been thinking about a lot actually because of this fucking 1776 commission. You know, this kind of attempt to impose a revisionist reading of our own history on us. Japan for a long time has had a revisionist prime minister. You know, Abe is somebody who, you know, he takes like kind of the controversial actions of like visiting a war shrine where like tons of war criminals are buried. He has kind of come to, there have been like continuous textbook controversies in Japan about the inclusion of comfort women, for example. I think that's kind of a sticking point and one that as a Korean I hear a lot about. And you know, whether they like invaded or like it just downplaying their war guilt and their history of colonialism. And so I don't have like particularly fond feelings towards the Japanese government. That said, you know, I've studied abroad in Japan. I'm fluent in Japanese. I actually speak better Japanese than Korean to my great shame. But and most of the young people that I don't think I've met any young Japanese people, let alone Japanese American people, who have any kind of animus towards Koreans. But you know, I do think that the history between those two countries is something that I've thought a lot about. And in fact, like I can kind of trace Your House Will Pay to that history. You know, my third book, what dealt a lot with ideas of legacy and guilt and shame and the way that like that groups experience these emotions. You know, it dealt with the denial by the Turkish government of the Armenian genocide, but it was kind of my way of talking about Japan and Korea. And it was coming out of that book that I decided to write this one, because Your House Will Pay is about people who are dealing with things that like they didn't do, but that they had no choice in anyway, and they still like inherit it and have to deal with that inheritance. I think that's a really interesting thing that these specific characters certainly grapple with to an intense degree. It's also something that like every American needs to grapple with at some point or another, that like they're in a country that exists and is prosperous for some like very specific reasons, and I think like we have to deal with that history. I kind of got away from your question, but
yeah, we covered so much. Okay, we're running out of time, so we're still getting a bunch more questions, but I'm gonna combine kind of the last two. Allison, who is an alumni of your high school, she graduated in the class of '85, wants to know what your writing process is, like your daily practice and ritual. And then also Blaze, our own Alta's managing editor, was curious, is The Plagues going to be part of a larger work? What are you working on next? So if you can, how do you write, and what are you writing right now that's coming up next?
In general, my writing process is I wake up, I like bullshit for like 2 hours, usually involving a Yelp review, because not now, but I used to write a Yelp review like every day. And that was kind of a way to kind of like flush out. That's the first writing I did every day, and it meant that I wrote every day no matter what. And then I do research, I hang out on Twitter. I mean, a lot of the like writing of any of my books just involves a lot of marinating and goofing off, to be honest. But I try to get like 2 to 3 hours of like solid writing done when I'm working on a book, and the way that I force myself to do that is I use the Pomodoro method, which is like you do any task for like 25 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you do 25 minutes, and I actually use a timer. And that actually forces me to write in a way that a lot of other things don't. So that has been effective. I feel like that helped me finish this book. As for The Plagues and what I'm working on now, so I finished Your House Will Pay last year, and then I pretty immediately got staffed on a TV show. And so I was writing on a show for 6 months, and that was a full-time job. And during that 6 months, I did not have time to like start a new book. And then I decided to like take a little break, and then the pandemic hit, and then I had a baby. And so at various points I was like, oh, I should start a new novel. And the upshot is I haven't started a new novel. But I was very happy when David Yulin reached out and asked if I was interested in writing a short story, because I thought, that seems like something that I could maybe do, and the timing kind of worked out right, because he asked me in like May and it was due in July, and like baby was like starting to get a little bit more manageable, and so I did that. But it took me like most of the month to write it, and it was extremely stressful, and I realized I wasn't quite ready. But now I feel like I could maybe start writing again, because he's sleeping through the night. We kind of have all of our rhythms like figured out. So maybe I could start. He just started nap. He took his first crib nap like today, like a couple hours ago. It was 20 minutes long. He's been napping in my arms until now. So I feel like I can start working on something new. I don't know that it won't really have to do with The Plagues. The Plagues is a short story that is very like of the moment. I wrote it in June, and it deals with the threat of like city mob violence, like outside the door, while you're like trapped at home with somebody who like might be dangerous. And that felt very much like the extent of my imagination at the time, which is it involved things going on right outside, and a pregnancy. So I think probably whatever I write will go a little farther afield. I am also curious though, what happens to Los Angeles as a result of the pandemic, because I write books that are very much rooted in this place, And this place is in a very uncertain transitional period right now, as is the rest of the world. And so I am curious about how it changes. You know, I know, for example, that before the pandemic, everyone was talking about homelessness in Los Angeles. That has been kind of the prevailing topic of the political conversation in LA for the last several years. And I don't think that the pandemic will have made it better. It kind of changed the subject a little bit, but I'm curious about how we will come out of this. You know, where will there be an enormous wave of evictions? Are we going to put like even more vulnerable people into the streets? Like you know, how will the pandemic affect the way that neighborhoods that were already kind of going through these like painful shifts in gentrification? You know, will that speed up that process? Will it exacerbate these shifts because it's a thing that has taken away power from people who already had very little power to begin with? Like, I don't know. And depending on the answers to some of these questions, you know, I could be writing a different kind of book. Which is also a very easy way to kind of let myself enjoy cuddling my baby and not working. But it is something I think about too. It does. I think it's hard to imagine writing a contemporary LA book without knowing what contemporary LA feels like.
Yeah. What TV show were you working on?
I was working on a crime show for HBO Max, and I don't know what the status of the show is, but it was a good experience.
Well, if it comes out, let us know and we'll watch. All right, we're over time. You guys, that was so lovely. Thank you. Thank you to everyone for joining. You can read Steph's short story again directly below. We've got links to that in there, to her Alta Asks with Oscar's review of Your House Will Pay. Join us next week, where I will be in conversation with Phil Bronstein and Tink Thompson. Phil wrote a feature in our Noir issue about old school San Francisco private eyes, of which Tink is one. So we will be talking with them here on Crowdcast at Alta Journal. You can follow us at Wednesday, October 7th at 12:30. With that, again, thank you to everyone for tuning in. Big thank you to Oscar, our good friend and a member of the Alta family, and Steph. We remain forever your major fans. I'm excited to see what you do. Thank you guys. Let your dog walk.
Welcome.
All right, this interview will be up on Alta Online later today if you missed anything of it. So again, thanks everyone and take care.